Before I begin, what I wanted to do was give you a bit of an anecdote. I was talking to my grandmother last night for reasons that were completely unrelated to this, and unfortunately she has Alzheimer's, and every time I speak to her she asks me, so what do you do at the AIC? And the answer to that question is invariably, I work at the Australian Institute of Criminology. She asks this question every time I speak to her. And she goes, gee, that's really interesting. Now, I'm sure many of you have that experience, of course, where you go to Christmas parties and you speak to family and they seem very interested in what you do. And it's that inevitable question that you kind of feel almost, at pains to continue to answer to everyone that asks. But last night in particular, interestingly enough, I mentioned to her when I was speaking to her that I was doing this presentation today, and she asked me what the topic was, and I said it was on drug use and crime and violence and crime and homicide. And she goes, oh, homicide, that's really interesting. I'd like to know more about that. I'm like, it's kind of weird. But she said, why drug use? Why is the Institute of Criminology looking at drug use? And it was kind of an interesting one because I hadn't actually given any thought to that, and I thought perhaps that was a nice segue into trying to I guess, explain to you what it is that the Institute of Criminology does in terms of drug use and what we do in terms of measuring the relationship between drug use and crime, and how that relates not only to the AIC's research agenda more generally, but how that relates to the national and even jurisdictional policy agenda, which I think is interesting and increasingly important. Of course, I told my nan after saying that, there's this much larger policy called the National Illicit Drug Strategy that was set up by John Howard when he was the Prime Minister in 1997, which actually was on the back of and I'll just get it here, the National Campaign Against Drug Abuse that Bob Hawke set up after, although I don't know how many of you saw the Hawke television show the other night, but you will all know if you did watch that his daughter actually had a heroin addiction, and the National Campaign Against Drug Abuse actually came out not long after he made what was otherwise a very public and sorry statement about what had happened in his life and his family. But of course none of that meant anything to my nan. She wasn't kind of interested in national policy. All she wanted to know was whether I was taking drugs and what I was doing about it. That was pretty much about it. So I thought what I would do is give you a very brief overview of what I told my nan after she said she wasn't interested, and I didn't obviously tell her about myself. I said to her that the reason why we study drugs at the AIC is because people die from using drugs. Now this is fairly sensationalist and quite extraordinary, but nevertheless this graph here is a measure over time of the number of New South Wales residents who died from overdoses from heroin between the years of 1995-96 through to 2006-07. And I would draw your attention obviously to the red line, because between 1995 and 1996 through to 1998-99, the number of people as a rate of the population per 100,000 who were dying from heroin overdoses had more than doubled. So we were obviously a bit concerned about that. Understandably, at a national policy level and even at a jurisdictional level, we were very concerned about what was actually going on in terms of our community and what was going on in terms of those people who were using drugs. Of course, after that time, the number of people who died from heroin overdoses, as you can see from that graph, obviously declined quite dramatically, and there's a whole number of reasons for that which I will get into later in the presentation. But nevertheless, much of what we do in terms of trying to understand the rates and prevalence of drug use in our community is driven a lot by what actually happens in the public health sphere, as well as the links between that and what actually happens in the criminal justice sphere. Let's not forget that drug use and selling drugs is actually an illegal activity, and so it's of interest obviously to both the Australian Institute of Criminology and indeed criminal justice agencies right around Australia to want to understand drug use and the extent and prevalence of drug use and its impacts of crime in the community. The next thing I told my nan is that, drug use costs everyone. The Australian Institute of Criminology a couple of years ago, actually 1 year ago, by a colleague, Kia Rawlings, did a study looking at the costs of crime to Australia, and part of that study was about trying to estimate the cost of drug-related crime to the Australian community. And the breakdown you can see there, that's in millions of dollars, but what I would draw your attention to, of course, is the last column at the bottom, which is the total cost estimated for in effect, drug-related crime to Australia, and that was estimated about $1.8 billion annually. That's a very, very conservative estimate. Two other academics from the University of New South Wales, Collins and Lapsley, actually estimate the social cost of illicit drug use to Australia at $55.6 billion annually. So this is a huge cost that's borne by everyone, taxpayers, the general community, and indeed those costs are spread not only just in terms of cost to the criminal justice system, but in terms of costs in loss of productivity, costs in terms of mental health, costs in terms of treatment services, and the whole range of things that occur in our society. But nevertheless, the key point here is that we're interested in trying to understand the prevalence and, of course, at the end of the day, reduce the prevalence of drug use in our community, because drug use costs everyone, and the costs are quite significant. The other reason I told her is that because the majority of crime is committed by a minority of offenders. Kelly, who just gave the presentation earlier, kind of basically said that point and showed you the age crime curves and so forth. But more importantly, offenders who use drugs, or at least drug use seems to be associated with prolific offending. So putting those two and two together tend to suggest that those who use drugs are those who are most likely to be prolific offenders. And if that's the case, if we take the recidivism literature as carrying any weight, then what we know is that drug users are likely to be contributing quite a significant quantity of crime in the Australian community. And that's not just drug-related crimes, as indeed we might otherwise think about them in terms of selling and using illicit drugs, but we're talking here also about property-related offences and a whole range of other community-related offences that drug users might otherwise be engaged in. The graph here is data that comes from a study that the AIC conducted on the drug use careers of offenders study. I won't be going into any great detail in that study in this presentation, except to say that it was a survey of prisoners that we conducted in 2001, 2003 and 2005. And basically what it just shows you is the proportion of prisoners at that time who, when we surveyed them, said that they were a current regular illicit drug user of any drug or a current regular polydrug user of an illicit drug in the 6 months prior to their detention. The argument being here that certainly almost 2/3 of every prisoner that we surveyed was a current regular user of at least one drug. They were in prison and their criminal histories were quite diverse and quite large.